Now, why does the truth matter? It matters because if we are really genuine in searching for what is right in science, we are asking, but asking genuinely, the question that Pontius Pilate, here in this picture by Tintoretto, asked rhetorically of our blessed Lord. And that was, what is the truth? Quid est veritas? And that question, though it was asked sneeringly by Pilate, who then didn't even stay around for an answer, is the question that in effect underlies every true and honest question. What we want to know is, what is the truth? Because the truth alone is worthy of our entire devotion. It is not for us to push the science in one direction or another, or the economics for that matter. It is for us just quietly to find out what the truth is and then speak it as honestly and straightforwardly as we may. And this point was well reflected by the very father of the scientific method, the gentleman you see on this Iraqi banknote now, who rejoiced in the name of Abu Ali ibn al-Hassan ibn al-Hussein ibn al-Hussein ibn al-Haytham. And he was a philosopher and mathematician and astronomer in 11th century Iraq. And it's his country that celebrates his contribution to science and to the philosophy of science on this banknote. And he said this, he said, the seeker after truth does not put his trust in any mere consensus, however broad, however venerable. Instead, he subjects what he has learnt from it to his hard-won scientific knowledge and to investigation and measurement and verification and checking and checking and checking again. The road to the truth, said Al-Haytham, is long and hard, but that is the road that we must follow. And that's the road that you and I are going to follow now. And we're going to first of all see why it matters that policymakers should take their decisions very carefully, particularly when those decisions are taken collectively by governments acting throughout the whole world at the same time. Then a wrong decision can have catastrophic consequences. Take an example. DDT, the only effective agent against the malaria mosquito, still to this day the only one that really works, invented by a guy who was given the Nobel Prize because he saved more lives with that one invention than anybody else in history. DDT was banned 40 years ago. Before it was banned, deaths from malaria had fallen to 50,000 a year. After the ban, 1 million a year. And these are children, mostly, because malaria chiefly kills children. If you're an adult, you'll get it, you'll be very sick with it. And if you're poor, it'll be extremely debilitating, but you will usually live. Children will all too often tragically die. So we're talking of 1 million deaths, largely of children, every year. And that persisted for 40 years, until on the 15th of September 2006, finally, after all those who had taken the original barking mad and utterly cruel decision had retired or died, then and only then did Dr. Arata Kochi of the World Health Organization say this: quite often in this field, politics comes first and science second. We must take a position based on the science and the data. And he then, and only then, lifted the ban on DDT and once again recommended it as the front line of defense against the malaria mosquito. And has he been heeded? Largely no, because those who were the descendants in political terms of those who originally had DDT banned simply weren't prepared to admit that that wrong decision had cost 40 million needless children's lives, 6 Holocausts over. And so they are still trying to ban DDT to this day, and still people are dying of malaria in altogether unacceptable numbers. And this is a tragedy caused simply by a failure to analyze policy correctly. All they had to do, instead of banning DDT, was to confine its use to the interior spraying of houses. That's where people usually get infected with malaria. If they'd eradicated the malaria from the houses, the DDT wouldn't in any way have got into the food chain. It wouldn't have done any harm to anything, but it would have spared very nearly all of those 40 million totally needless deaths. Now, those who watch what I'm doing and don't like it regularly post stuff on their websites saying that I'm lying about this. But there are 2 scientific papers from which I got the figures for how many have died as a result of the DDT ban. So I'm not just making stuff up. HIV is another one. And I feel personally a bit responsible for this one because when I was working for Margaret Thatcher, my advice was that they should isolate every carrier, they should identify who was carrying HIV, at that time a very small number, isolate them in a humane and gentle way, but permanently and completely, and therefore stop the disease from spreading. That's the normal public health response when a new fatal infection heaves over the horizon and starts killing people, because otherwise you kill tens of millions. And I went to see the people at US AMRIAD, the Medical Research Institute for Infectious Diseases of the US Army. And they begged me, they said, please, the chief researcher said, please write on both sides of the Atlantic articles advocating in the strongest terms that there should be isolation of carriers for this disease, or tens of millions are going to die. We've tried to talk to our Surgeon General, he won't do it. And by the way, don't say anything about us, because we'll lose our jobs if you do. Well, they've retired now, so I can. But I wrote those articles, and I've been vilified ever since by the pressure groups that succeeded in making sure that the correct public health measures were not taken. Result, you can see on the screen there, these are UN figures. Again, everything I tell you comes from somewhere verifiable. 25 million dead, somewhere between 33 and 40 million infected, depending on which set of UN figures you use, and real tragedy, south of the Sahara, 7.5% of the population infected. And let's bring this down to individuals. Here is one person. Now, this lady had already had 2 lads who died of AIDS contracted in the womb. Her 3rd son, you see here, is already dying. He died a month after Reuters took this photograph. And she died a year later because I failed. Because I failed to convince policymakers that they should do what was already known to be the right thing in policy terms. And because a pressure group came in and said, we don't care about the science, we care only about the views of our pressure group. The correct policy wasn't followed, and this lady and so many tens of millions other like her needlessly died as a direct result. And here is how they're killing people already with the global warming scare, because they've got the science wrong, and then they've got the policy wrong, and then they've started killing people and killing them by the million. This time, what they've done in the last 2 or 3 years is to take millions of hectares of agricultural land out of growing food for people who need it and into growing biofuels for clunkers that don't. Result, a doubling of world food prices a couple of years ago. Result, mass starvation and death in a dozen major regions of the planet. And the result, of course, was food riots in each of those major regions. You only get food riots when you've got mass starvation that suddenly comes and people are suddenly left unable to pay for their food. And here is one example. This is from Haiti, and it's before the hideous earthquake that's just struck that benighted country. Here is a guy starving himself, trying to make a living by making mud pies made with real mud. You take dirt, you take out all the weeds and the stones and the grit, and you mash it into a paste, probably using dirty water. Then you add a pinch of butter and a pinch of salt, if you can afford them. And then you mash them and mash them into a paste to try to make them somehow palatable. You can imagine how disgusting they taste. And then you leave them out in the sun for a few hours to dry, and then you sell them to your neighbors for 3 US cents each. Our fellow humans, our fellow citizens of this great planet, we are allowing them to do this because we do not care enough about alleviating poverty. Instead, we're busy spending $100 billion and counting on the non-problem of climate change. And I told this story recently at a meeting of government and opposition leaders in Madrid. And one of the ladies in the front row burst into tears. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to cause distress here. But she said, well, no, it's just, I've just come back from Haiti and I'm afraid your story is out of date. And I said, do update me. She said, because of the doubling of world food prices caused by the biofuel scare, caused by the global warming scare, she said, now they can't even afford 3 cents for a mud pie, and they're dying in even larger numbers than before. And she said, you are the first person I have ever heard from the governing class anywhere in the West who appears to have the slightest knowledge of the damage that is being done by the biofuel scam in the poorer countries of the world. And she said, I'm weeping because I now have some hope that we can start doing something about it. Now that is a tragedy. That's what it is. It's a tragedy on an enormous scale. It's the third such tragedy in the last 40 years, caused by wrong-headed, badly designed, global groupthink instead of proper policy making.